basically, I went to school in the States. I went to university, and I got my master's degree in economics. I studied for 4 years in undergrad economics, and I got my master's degree in international economics. And something that was very interesting was that I was drilled by my economics professors talking about rational choice theory. And what rational choice theory says, if you're a rational individual, you're always going to want more of something, okay? And an individual basically makes decisions based on a cost-benefit analysis. Well, I always started thinking about that, like cost-benefit analysis that makes me advantageous or is advantageous to the person who's a consumer. And then I would go basically to Starbucks and buy a $3 cup of coffee. And I'd be like, well, why am I buying a $3 cup of coffee when I can go next door and buy the same cup of coffee for $1.50? And then I started thinking, well, maybe I have a problem. Maybe I'm not a rational individual. Maybe there's something wrong with me. You know, and then I started looking at other products. Why would I buy CocaCola instead of a generic sort of cola? And I started wondering this whole rational choice theory. And then, you know, for 6 years, this was drilled in my brain. Then I got into politics, and I started studying a little bit more. And Sigmund Freud talked about the conscious versus the unconscious. That 10% of your brain is conscious, and the other 90% is unconscious. And I started thinking about that a lot. And the reason that I started thinking about that was that people really don't always think in a rational form. There's always emotion involved. And my economics professors would tell me, Jimmy, emotions get in the way of rational thinking. And if you think about that for a second, it makes sense. You always think, well, every human being is rational and they make rational decisions. And emotions always get in the way of rational thinking. In actuality, it's the other way around, from what I learned. Rational thinking actually gets in the way of the unconscious mind, gets in the way of emotion. It's the other way around, it's not that way. And what I learned was when I was in Washington, I started doing campaigns, I started figuring out why would a lot of these candidates, you know, start promising things to people like, hey, I'm gonna build you a house, I'm gonna build you a road, I'm gonna build you a school, I'm gonna get you better health care. But it didn't really move people, okay? It didn't really move a person. There wasn't a connection. Like if I sat here and you saw a bunch of candidates, they always talk about the same thing. They always talk about how we're gonna give you better education. They always talk about how they're gonna give you better health care. They always talk about all these things, and they're competing one against the other without saying really anything that separates them from the other. Okay, they don't bring emotion, feelings into the whole equation. So once you start understanding that campaigns and communications is not only about a rational way to think about things, but it's an unconscious and it's sort of an emotional way where you need to move people, then you start developing new tools. And this is what I call share to care. And this is something very important that I've started to use a lot in campaigns. I don't do your typical campaign. I do a lot more of sharing with the voter. Why? Because I'm looking for a connection. I want to connect with you. I don't just want to sit here and tell you what I'm going to give you. I want to actually have some sort of connection with you. I want you to understand where I'm coming from. For example, it's not the same thing to stand up here if I was a politician and say, hey, I'm going to give you universal health care, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to give you that, but actually tell a story. Said, hey, my father right now is going through cancer. I've seen in the eyes of other patients what they go through, the difficulty there is in different diseases that we all go through. And that is why I feel very strongly about providing a better health care for our community. What I'm doing there is actually connecting with the individual. I'm actually telling them something about myself. I'm not just standing up here and saying, hey, I'm going to give you health care. I'm actually sharing, I'm opening myself up to you. I'm sharing something with you that you don't know about. And what you start creating is this sort of synergy with the voters. And politicians, a lot of ways, are very cold. They just stand in front of a podium and they just start telling you what they're going to do. And a lot of times they fail, and they fail because they skip this. They skip the emotional part of things. They skip that 90% that Sigmund Freud talked about, that unconscious level, which is beneath the water of the iceberg. So you need to share so that people believe that you care. And then we come up into the narrative. What is the narrative? Okay? Narratives are part of a campaign. They're part of everyday life, stories, movies. Everything has a narrative. Everything has a hero. Everything has a villain. There's always a battle in between the narrative, the story, and it's the same thing in campaigns. You need to have an issue that you need to debate with the villain, which should be your opponent. You shouldn't be the villain. And you need to have a hero. Okay? And why this is important to understand, it's because, for example, every single movie that you see, every single cartoon that you watch, has a narrative inside of it. Imagine for a second, for 1 second, okay? I think everyone knows Batman. Let's use Batman as an example. Okay? Imagine if you started watching a Batman movie right at the middle, or you heard for the first time the Batman story, and you saw a man go to his house, put on some black tights, and decide to go out and fight crime. You know, you think that there's something wrong with that individual. I mean, why would a person put on some black tights, put a cape around, and say, hey, you know what, I'm going out to fight crime? You know, there is no context there. There is a context when you know that Batman, for example, lost his father and his mother to a problem of insecurity, and that's why he decided to take on fighting crime. I don't know if you're starting to understand what I'm trying to say, but there is an emotional connection, there is an understanding where this person comes from. And a lot of times, candidates do the same thing. They stand up in front of a crowd and they just start spewing over things that they're going to do for the voter. I'm going to, cut your taxes. I'm going to build you more schools. I'm going to build you more roads. I'm going to build you a bunch of stuff, but they don't really connect with the voter. There isn't really a synergy with the voter. There is no narrative, no understanding of where that candidate comes from to make those decisions of why he wants to fight for those issues or why they want to fight for the voters. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. This is something else. Napoleon Bonaparte said, you need to stand for something. He who defends everything defends nothing. He who defends everything defends nothing. What does that mean? That basically means that you need to take a stand on the issue, depending on the issue that you're talking about. You're either for gay rights or you're against gay rights. You're either for abortion, you're against abortion. You need to take a stand on different issues. You just can't be wishy-washy. People want to know where you stand. People want to know if you're black or if you're white. People don't like gray area when I'm talking about an issue. They like to know where a person or a candidate stands on the different issues. And there's a lack of brain space right now. And you'll understand what I'm trying to say with this, is that people get bombarded every single day with different issues. They get bombarded at work with coworkers, they get bombarded from the internet, they get bombarded from TV, radio, newspaper, and every day there's more and more information getting thrown at people. So you don't have that much brain space to think about every single thing. So what you need to do in a campaign, for example, when you're pushing forward a candidate, is a concentration of power, firepower. What does that mean? To be able to, in battle strategy, the way to win a war is to concentrate firepower on a certain point. You can't spread your guns everywhere, you need to focus. By that, what do I mean? There's many times people who think that they need to be everyone, they need to be everything to everyone. They need to be right on energy. They need to be right on the environment. They need to be right on security. They need to be right on healthcare, education. You don't have to pick every single topic and campaign on that. That's why we have polls. Polls are basically, it's the same thing as if you went to the doctor. What is the first thing the doctor says? Hey, you need to get a blood work drawn. We need to figure out what's wrong with you. And the same thing is what a poll does. You get a survey, you go out, you ask people, hey, what is the number one concern there is, for example, in Panama or in the United States? And they'll tell you what the number one concern of the country is. But if you ask them, what is the number one concern of you and your family? 9 times out of 10, that number one concern of yours and your family is different from what people think is the number one concern in the country. So basically you use that issue that you get from the people to understand what is their problems, because at the end, people want candidates or presidents or whoever, elected officials, who are going to fix their problem, their own personal problem, okay? And they want you to understand what those problems are, and to achieve that, you need to use polling data. Another thing that is very important is, why is Coca-Cola Coca-Cola? Coca-Cola is basically the same thing as Pepsi, and even though they do those little, tests where they do that blind test where they put Coke and they put Pepsi one next to the other and they ask you which one's better, Pepsi a lot of times wins the taste challenge or whatever they call it. The reason Coke is number one is because they got to the market first. The same thing as Hertz and the same things that every other brand. You need to get to the market first. If you find out what the issue is important for your candidate, or your issue is important for the constituency that you're trying to sway, you need to be the first person out there talking about either security, either jobs, either whatever the issue is that people want fixed in their community. Don't be number 2, because you'll end up being Avis, okay? You might try harder, but you're not gonna be number 1 on the issues. And know what you get with a brand. Your candidate or the person who's running needs to be a brand. What I mean by that is you know exactly what you get when you walk into a McDonald's. You can walk into a McDonald's here in Panama, New York, Europe, China, or wherever, wherever you go and there's a McDonald's. A Big Mac will always taste the same. That's why you go to a McDonald's, because you basically know what you get with the brand. So your candidate, people need to know exactly what that person stands for, and people need to know what they get with your candidate. They need to know where he stands on the issues, and they need to know that that quality of the person is not going to vary. He's always going to be the same. Our brain hears different things, okay? And this is very important. It's not what you say, it's what people hear, okay? These two issues are exactly the same. Democrats like to talk about the inheritance tax, for example. Republicans like to talk about the death tax. Why? One is for that tax and the other one's against the tax. When you talk about death tax, even though it's the same thing as inheritance tax, there's a negative connotation to it. There's something that you hear that you don't like. It's unfair. You don't want to pay for a death tax. It's the same thing as support our war. No one wants to support the war. There's no rallies out there saying let's support the war. What we rally around is support the troops. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. So you need to be very, very careful in the way you communicate things. Because you might be saying the same exact thing, but the people might be hearing 2 different things, okay? That's why we do focus groups, that's why we do studies. That's why we do all these different, use these marketing tools to be able to pinpoint what people hear when you present them with these certain different issues. And all of these slogans have been tested. It's not that someone came up with them, they've all been tested and retested and retested. The clock doesn't stop, technology is always changing. and it's always changing, not only in politics, but also for presidents who want to communicate within their country. For example, Chavez was the first one who made popular in Latin America the whole Twitter. You love jumping on Twitter, you love talking on that TV program that he had every Saturday night, Algo Presidente, and he would talk about who tweeted him, what they tweeted him, or whatever. So new tools of communications are coming about. We didn't have that 20 years before. And presidents have the opportunity to basically communicate directly with their constituents. But you need to be careful. For example, our former president had someone who was running his Twitter account basically congratulating Manny Pacquiao for being Panamanian and doing such a good job in one of his fights. So all the front pages of the newspapers came out saying, you know, you're an ignorant, how could you not know that the guy isn't from Panama? And he basically had to come out and say he fired the woman who was in charge of his Twitter account. So it's a double-edged sword, because communication flies a lot quicker now. Before it was TV, radio, and print newspaper. Now communication flies, and everyone wants their communication faster. You know, in the age of newspapers, print newspaper, in the next 5-10 years, we're not going to see any more print newspapers. It's all going to be over the internet, and people want their information quicker. There's a lot of sites now that you can build your own newspapers tailored to yourself on the information that you want to hear and you want to read. So what campaigns are doing now, what a lot of presidents are able to do is basically look at all your Twitter accounts and all your Facebook accounts and understand exactly what you like and what you dislike. They can now pinpoint and say, all right, you're interested in guns, you're a hunter, you're someone who likes guns, you're a person who is part of a union, you're a person who is part of, you know, the teacher society or whatever, or you have 2 kids. And now the messages are being tailored even more closely toward people. There's even certain software out there that is even a little bit scarier. They can find out, for example, who the biggest influencer is on Twitter on a specific issue, right? And this is very important to understand. It's not just who has the most amount of followers that it matters. It's also getting to the point where they know who the most who are the biggest influencers on certain issues, and they can actually tailor the messages to those people who will retweet it, and they are an authority on a certain issue. So the impact is a lot stronger. It's not the same thing to have someone from the communications community coming out and talking about healthcare. And you see that a lot. Just because a person has 1 million followers, they start giving them the opportunity to tweet whatever. And people who want to know about the issue know that that person is not an authority on that issue. So even though they have a lot of followers and they tweet something out there, it doesn't mean that the penetration actually gets to the people that they should be getting. And the president, now talking more about the president of a country or an elected official should not bully. And there's a lot of that going on. The president is someone who's looked at as someone who's up on the hill and should not attack a constituent, should not find himself or herself attacking a person either over the internet or in person or over the media. It's very important for the president always to maintain his or her stature. And this is something important. John Quincy Adams said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, then you're a leader. And what does that mean? It basically means that a president's job is not to campaign, it's not to promise, it's actually to inspire and have people follow them and do what they want to follow them, and always give positive messages, okay? And that's a lot of times where presidents go out on the media and they vent their problems or whatever is happening in the country. That is not a leader. A leader comes out and inspires and makes people believe that we can move forward no matter what. Thank you very much.